I remember the exact moment I realized my family had stolen from me. It wasn't when I first saw the moving truck parked in the driveway of the house I'd rebuilt with my own hands. It wasn't even when my mother handed me the notarized transfer of ownership with that practiced smile of hers, the one that always meant uncomfortable conversations were being avoided. No, it was when I stepped back inside what had been my home for 11 years and felt nothing but the hollow echo of my footsteps against hardwood floors I had sanded and stained myself. I ran my fingers along the kitchen counter I had installed during those endless summer weekends, breathing in the lingering scent of lemon polish I always used, and I understood with perfect clarity. This was a theft dressed up as family planning, a betrayal costumed as practicality. I had purchased the foreclosure when I was 30, working as a structural engineer for a modest firm that paid me just enough to qualify for the mortgage. The house had been abandoned for years. Water damage had warped the floors, mold crept up the bathroom walls, and the previous owners had stripped out anything of value before the bank took possession. But beneath the decay, I saw bones worth saving. I saw potential where others saw only liability. The realtor had laughed when I made my offer, warning me that I was buying a demolition project, not a home. "No one renovates houses like this anymore," she said, passing me the keys with a pitying glance. "It will be cheaper to tear it down and start over." But cheaper had never been my motivation. I wanted to build something lasting, something that represented the steadiness I'd always tried to embody within my family. The quiet, reliable son who fixed problems rather than creating them. For years, I lived in a single functional room while renovating the rest. I learned plumbing from library books and YouTube videos, teaching my hands to sweat copper pipes and replace ancient cast iron with modern PVC. I studied electrical work, carefully mapping circuits and installing new wiring throughout the house, staying up until 3 in the morning on workdays to finish one more section before collapsing into sleep. Every paycheck went first to the mortgage, which I paid bi-weekly instead of monthly to reduce the principal faster, and then to materials for the next phase of renovation. I ate simply. I drove an old truck that protested with each winter start. I declined weekends away with friends to install insulation or hang drywall. The house consumed my 30s, but I never resented the sacrifice. I was building equity, yes, but more importantly, I was building proof that patience and dedication could transform disaster into security. My parents visited only twice during those first 5 years. "Too much dust," my mother complained, preferring instead to invite me to their immaculate suburban home for Sunday dinners where my sister Allison would regale them with stories about her latest promotion or vacation. Allison had always been the family constellation around which everyone orbited, bright, demanding, and accustomed to having her desires treated as necessities. She worked in pharmaceutical sales, a job that rewarded her innate ability to make people feel simultaneously special and slightly inadequate. Our parents beamed when she spoke of commission checks and company retreats. They nodded politely when I mentioned installing a new water heater or reinforcing the sagging joist beneath the upstairs bathroom. My accomplishments were practical rather than prestigious, and in our family, practicality was expected rather than celebrated. When the housing market began its unexpected recovery, my careful investment suddenly appreciated beyond anyone's predictions. The neighborhood transformed as young professionals discovered its affordable proximity to downtown. Corner stores became artisanal coffee shops. Abandoned lots sprouted community gardens. The derelict property I had purchased for $115,000 was now conservatively valued at over $500,000. My parents started mentioning my good fortune at family gatherings, as though the house's value had materialized through luck rather than through thousands of hours of labor. They began visiting more frequently, admiring the crown molding I had meticulously restored and the kitchen I had configured to maximize the natural light. "You should protect this asset," my father said during one such visit, swirling a glass of whiskey I had saved for special occasions. "Put in the family trust. For tax purposes." I trusted my father's financial advice. He had built a comfortable retirement through careful planning and conservative investments. When he explained how placing the house in the family trust would shield it from excessive estate taxes and provide a safety net for all of us should medical expenses or other emergencies arise, I agreed. The paperwork seemed straightforward. I would remain the primary resident and decision-maker, but the house would be held within the larger family trust my parents had established decades earlier. Just a formality, my father assured me, his hand heavy on my shoulder. Nothing changes in practice. This protects everyone. I signed the documents without reading the fine print that would later allow my parents, as trust administrators, to reassign beneficial ownership without my explicit consent, a detail that would prove catastrophic. The transfer happened while I was at a 3-day structural engineering conference in Phoenix. I returned to find Allison's silver SUV in my driveway, boxes stacked on my front porch, and my parents standing on a lawn I had reseeded just the previous spring. The confusion must have shown on my face because my mother immediately launched into her explanation. Allison's divorce had been finalized. She needed a fresh start. The apartment she had been renting was too expensive on a single income, even with her commissions. They had all discussed it and determined this was the most sensible solution. "You're always so practical, Evan," my mother said, her voice both soothing and slightly defensive. "We knew you'd understand that Allison needs this house more than you do right now. You can stay in the guest room until you find a new place. We've already started looking at condos that would be perfect for someone like you. Someone like me. Someone whose needs were always secondary. Someone who could be displaced without consultation because his reliability had been mistaken for malleability." I didn't argue. I didn't demand explanations or justice. I simply walked through the front door one last time, past my sister who was directing movers where to place her oversized leather sectional, and into what had been my bedroom. I packed my clothes into 2 suitcases. I carefully wrapped the hand-blown glass vase I had purchased to celebrate paying off the mortgage early. I collected my tools, the compound miter saw, the belt sander, the router I had saved for months to afford. I loaded everything into my truck while my parents watched with nervous smiles, as though waiting for my inevitable acquiescence, the moment when I would transform their theft into generosity by pretending it was my idea all along. "You'll come for dinner on Sunday?" my mother called as I closed the truck's tailgate. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and drove to a hotel where I paid for a week in advance, then sat on the edge of the bed and allowed myself exactly 1 hour of silent rage before beginning to search for apartments. I did go to dinner that Sunday, and the Sunday after that. I answered questions about my new apartment with minimal details. I listened to Allison describe her plans to update her kitchen with marble countertops that would require reinforcing the cabinetry I had built by hand. I watched my father refill wine glasses while explaining how this arrangement benefited everyone. "The trust still owns the asset," he repeated, as though the house were merely an investment vehicle rather than the physical manifestation of a decade of my life. "The family still benefits. And Allison needed the stability right now, with everything she's going through." I nodded and passed the potatoes and did not mention that I had also needed stability when I purchased a house that required wearing a respirator just to enter. I had needed stability when I worked 60-hour weeks and then came home to replace rotted subflooring. I had created my own stability when none was offered to me, and now that stability had been redistributed without my consent. The first notice arrived 3 months later, a certified letter addressed to the trust, forwarded to me because I was still listed as the property's primary contact. The Homeowners Association was issuing fines for multiple violations: improper waste disposal, noise complaints from neighbors, unauthorized exterior modifications. I scanned the document, then filed it away without comment. 2 weeks later, a second notice arrived indicating the property's insurance payment was overdue. The following month brought a letter from the county tax assessor regarding delinquent property taxes. Each document I placed in a dedicated folder, maintaining the methodical organization that had defined my professional life. I did not call my sister. I did not alert my parents. I simply watched from a distance as the machinery of consequence began its slow, inevitable rotation. My mother called in early December, her voice tight with forced casualness. There seems to be some confusion about the house payments, she began, as though discussing a minor misunderstanding rather than financial negligence. Allison thought you were handling the taxes and insurance through the trust. I let the silence stretch between us, forcing her to continue without my assistance. Obviously, she needs to take responsibility for those things now, but there's quite a bit overdue. We were hoping you might have records of the payment schedules and amounts. I did have those records, meticulously maintained in labeled folders on my laptop. I had payment confirmations, tax assessments, insurance policies, and HOA guidelines. All the documentation that Allison could have requested directly from the relevant authorities had she bothered to take ownership of her responsibilities along with my house. I'll email what I have, I said finally, and did exactly that, attaching only the most recent statements without any explanatory notes or helpful suggestions for resolving the mounting delinquencies. Winter deepened into the kind of bitter cold that reveals infrastructural weaknesses. My sister called on a Tuesday evening, her voice oscillating between accusation and panic. The pipes had frozen and burst in the downstairs bathroom, the one I had completely renovated 2 years earlier, installing frost-resistant fixtures and additional insulation around the exterior wall. The plumber says there's water damage in the ceiling and maybe the walls, she reported. Insurance won't cover it because the policy lapsed. Mom said you might know someone who could fix it for less than what these companies are quoting. I didn't know someone myself. I had the skills to assess the damage, remove saturated drywall, treat for potential mold, and restore the bathroom to its previous condition. I could have done for free what would cost thousands to outsource. Unfortunately, I don't, I replied and recommended she contact her homeowner's insurance provider. I don't have insurance yet, she admitted. I thought it was paid annually through the trust. I confirmed that it was indeed paid annually, and the payment had been due in October. Then I wished her good luck and ended the call. My father's message came the following weekend, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant on my voicemail. Evan, we need to discuss the house situation. There are some complications with the trust arrangement that require your input. Call me when you have time. I did not call back immediately. Instead, I spent the day installing floating shelves in my apartment, appreciating the simple pleasure of measuring twice and drilling once, of seeing immediate results from careful effort. When I finally returned his call that evening, he wasted no time on pleasantries. The bank has flagged the mortgage for review, he explained. Something about the transfer of beneficial ownership triggering a reassessment of the trust's terms. They're claiming we violated the mortgage agreement by transferring occupancy without notification. The worry in his voice was genuine, and for a moment, I felt the familiar tug of familial obligation, the deeply ingrained instinct to solve problems that threatened the family's stability. But I reminded myself that I was no longer the designated problem solver. I was no longer responsible for maintaining what had been taken from me. What does the bank recommend? I asked, my tone professionally neutral, as though discussing a structural issue with a client rather than the potential financial collapse of my family. My father sighed, and I could picture him removing his reading glasses to pinch the bridge of his nose, his habitual gesture when confronted with difficulties he hadn't anticipated. They're suggesting we either restore the original ownership arrangement or refinance under Allison's name. But her credit isn't. Well, the divorce impacted her financial standing, and the missed payments have already been reported. They're talking about acceleration clauses and potential foreclosure if we can't resolve this quickly. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had rescued this house from foreclosure once before through sheer determination and countless sacrifices. Now I was being asked to rescue it again, not for myself, but for the sister who had accepted it as her due and the parents who had facilitated the transfer without considering the consequences. I see, I said finally. That sounds complicated. I offered neither solutions nor sympathy, and after an uncomfortable silence, my father cleared his throat and changed the subject. The formal notice of default arrived in February, copied to all parties associated with the trust. The bank had determined that the transfer violated specific terms of the mortgage agreement, and the subsequent payment delinquencies constituted grounds for initiating foreclosure proceedings. My mother called while I was reviewing structural plans for a new municipal building, her voice trembling with a combination of indignation and fear. "This is ridiculous," she insisted. "They can't foreclose on a property that's fully paid off." But the house wasn't fully paid off, not technically. While I had satisfied the original mortgage 2 years earlier, I had subsequently taken a home equity line of credit to fund the final major renovations: a new roof, upgraded windows, and the complete kitchen remodel that had transformed the house from merely habitable to genuinely impressive. That line of credit, secured by the property and held by the same bank that had financed the initial purchase, included specific provisions regarding ownership transfers. Provisions I had read and understood, but which my parents had evidently overlooked in their haste to provide Allison with a fresh start at my expense. "You need to help fix this," my mother continued, abandoning pretense for direct appeal. "You know more about these financial arrangements than anyone. Allison is completely overwhelmed. She can't handle a foreclosure on top of everything else right now." The subtext was clear. I was punishing my sister by refusing to intervene, allowing a valuable family asset to be threatened out of spite or resentment. What my mother couldn't or wouldn't understand was that my inaction wasn't punitive. It was instructive. Some lessons can only be learned through consequence, and my family had deferred this particular education for too long. "I'm not sure what you expect me to do," I replied evenly. "The house isn't mine anymore. The decisions aren't mine to make." My mother's frustration was palpable even through the phone. "You're better than this, Evan," she said, deploying the guilt that had always been her most effective tool. "This affects all of us. Think of your father's legacy." I did think of it. The legacy of assumptions and uneven expectations, of one child whose needs automatically superseded another's, of contribution confused with entitlement. "I have to get back to work," I said, ending the call before she could elaborate on exactly how much better I should be than my current boundaries allowed. March brought an unexpected snowfall and a message from Martin Coleman, my former neighbor whose meticulous garden had often provided quiet conversation during weekend mornings spent working on our respective properties. Martin had moved to Arizona the previous year, but we had maintained occasional contact through email and holiday cards. His message was brief but revelatory. "Ran into your parents at Craig and Diane's anniversary dinner last weekend. Surprised to hear they've been planning that house transfer for years. Your dad mentioned they always assumed you'd keep maintaining the place regardless of whose name was on the deed. Thought you might want to know they're telling people you abandoned your responsibilities to the family trust. Didn't sound right based on what I know of you. Hope you're well." I read the message twice, then closed my laptop and stood at my apartment window, watching snow accumulate on unfamiliar trees. Years. They had been planning for years to transfer my house, my investment, my creation, to my sister, while allowing me to continue investing time and money into what they never truly saw as mine. They had discussed this plan among themselves, perhaps at those same Sunday dinners where I dutifully appeared with homemade bread or a bottle of wine, never suspecting that my inheritance was being redistributed around me. I had never been an owner in their eyes. I had been a caretaker they could replace when a more pressing need arose. The revelation should have devastated me, but instead, it provided an unexpected clarity. The anger that had simmered beneath my careful composure didn't intensify. It transformed into something cooler and more refined: certainty. I had spent most of my life trying to earn approval through reliability, mistaking my family's willingness to accept my sacrifices for genuine appreciation of my worth. But appreciation requires recognition, and they had never truly seen me. They had seen only what I could provide, what I could fix, what I could surrender without complaint. In that moment of understanding, standing in an apartment that still didn't feel like home, I released the last threads of obligation that had kept me tethered to their expectations. I would no longer measure my value against their assessment. I would no longer subordinate my needs to preserve family harmony. I would no longer participate in a system designed to extract my contributions while minimizing my humanity. The foreclosure process accelerated as spring advanced. The bank posted official notices, scheduled inspections, and began the formal documentation required by state law. My father's messages became increasingly urgent, then accusatory, then pleading. Old family friends reached out with careful inquiries that barely disguised their assigned mission to negotiate my intervention. Your sister is devastated. One particularly persistent family acquaintance reported during an unexpected visit to my office. She's not sleeping. Your parents are considering taking out loans against their retirement to save the house. Is that really what you want? What I wanted had never been the family's primary concern, but I didn't bother explaining this. I simply thanked him for his concern and returned to my work, leaving him to report my apparent callousness to those who had sent him. 3 weeks before the scheduled foreclosure auction, Allison texted me directly for the first time since moving into my house. If you cover the past dues, I'll put you back on the deed. We can co-own or whatever. Just don't let the bank take it. A clumsy attempt at negotiation from someone who had never needed to develop that skill. I didn't respond, and 2 days later, my parents proposed an in-person meeting to mediate a resolution that works for everyone. Their definition of everyone had always been selective, and their understanding of works had always favored specific outcomes over genuine equity. I declined with professional courtesy, explaining that I had prior commitments that couldn't be rescheduled. This wasn't entirely untrue. I had committed to myself, to my own well-being, to the novel concept that my time and resources belonged primarily to me, rather than to those who had demonstrated they valued them only for what could be extracted. I didn't attend the foreclosure auction. I didn't drive past the house to witness its transition from family asset to bank inventory. I didn't need that kind of ceremonial closure. Instead, I saved the public listing when it appeared online, documenting the final chapter of a property I had rescued, restored, and ultimately released. The listing photos showed rooms I had rebuilt, painted in colors I had selected, illuminated by fixtures I had installed. They showed the deck where I had spent summer evenings watching fireflies emerge from the carefully tended perennial garden. They showed the home office with built-in bookshelves that had taken an entire month of weekends to construct and finish. But they didn't show the thousands of invisible repairs, the structural reinforcements, the upgraded wiring, the meticulous waterproofing that had transformed a condemned property into a desirable residence. They didn't show the man who had poured his 30s into creating something beautiful and enduring, only to discover that what endures isn't always what we build with our hands. My parents didn't speak to me for 6 months after the foreclosure was finalized. My sister blocked my number and removed me from her social media connections. Extended family members treated me with the careful distance reserved for those who have violated unspoken rules. I was the son who had allowed a valuable family asset to be foreclosed upon rather than continuing to assume responsibility for what had been taken from him. I was the brother who had failed to rescue his sister from consequences that arrived with mathematical certainty. I was the family disappointment, not because I had done something wrong, but because I had refused to do what was expected despite being wronged. The estrangement was painful at first, then strangely peaceful. Without the constant pull of imbalanced expectations, I discovered space for relationships based on mutual respect rather than calculated obligation. I reconnected with college friends who remembered me before I became defined by what I could provide. I joined a local woodworking collective where my skills were appreciated without being exploited. I dated thoughtfully for the first time in years, no longer subconsciously evaluating potential partners based on whether my family would find them impressive enough to temporarily shift attention from my sister. 14 months after watching my family redistribute my most significant asset, I closed on a small cottage overlooking the river that wound through the less developed edge of town. The property wasn't impressive by conventional standards, just under 1,000 square feet with a detached workshop that had originally been built as a garage. But it sat on nearly an acre of land, with century-old oak trees providing privacy and shade. The interior needed updating, but not rescuing. The previous owners had maintained it with obvious care despite limited resources for cosmetic improvements. The inspection revealed solid bones beneath the dated finishes, exactly the kind of good structure that rewarded thoughtful enhancement rather than complete renovation. I paid cash, using savings I had accumulated since moving into my apartment and selling investments I had maintained separate from the family trust. The deed listed only my name, with no trust entanglements, no family co-signers, no shared interest that could be redistributed without my consent. When I signed the closing documents, the real estate agent commented on my apparent calm. Most people are a bundle of nerves at closing, especially single buyers taking on all the responsibility themselves, she observed. I smiled and explained that sole responsibility felt more secure than shared entitlement. I moved in on a Saturday in early autumn, when the river reflected gold and crimson from the turning trees along its banks. The cottage needed work, not the desperate stabilization my previous house had required, but the thoughtful customization that transforms a building into a home. I began with the workshop, installing proper insulation, upgrading the electrical service, and building the workbenches and storage systems that would support future projects. I took my time, working evenings and weekends without the frantic urgency that had characterized my earlier renovation. This wasn't a race against deterioration or a proof of competence. This was an expression of intention, the deliberate creation of space that served my needs and reflected my values. I installed skylights to provide natural illumination for detailed work. I built floor-to-ceiling shelving for books that had remained in storage during my apartment interlude. I designed and constructed a window seat beneath the living room's eastern exposure, creating the perfect spot for morning coffee and river contemplation. On my 43rd birthday, I hung a single framed photograph on the entryway wall, not a family portrait or an architectural rendering of my new home, but a close-up of my hands during that first renovation. The image captured them covered in plaster dust, slightly bloodied from an encounter with exposed lath, steadily holding a trowel against partially repaired drywall. A friend had taken the picture during one of the rare times I had accepted help, more as documentation than celebration. Looking at it now, I recognized what I hadn't seen then. The quiet dignity in those hands, the stubborn persistence, the willingness to endure temporary discomfort for lasting creation. Those hands had built a house that was taken from me, but they had also built the man who survived that taking. The man who learned that genuine security comes not from what you own, but from what you understand about yourself. The man who discovered that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't fighting or fixing, but simply stepping aside and allowing false systems to collapse under their own corruption. My parents reached out cautiously as the second anniversary of the foreclosure approached. My father called first, his message carefully constructed to avoid both accusation and apology. "We haven't spoken in too long," he said, as though our estrangement had been a mutual drift rather than a consequence of their actions. "Your mother and I would like to have dinner sometime, wherever you're comfortable meeting." I considered the invitation for several days before responding, examining my own readiness for reconciliation without rehabilitation. I agreed to meet them at a restaurant equidistant between our homes, neutral territory that wouldn't require either hospitality or intrusion. The dinner was predictably awkward. Conversations that skirted meaningful topics, observations about weather and local developments, careful inquiries about my work that avoided any mention of property or renovation. My mother studied me with barely concealed assessment, perhaps searching for signs of bitterness or hardship. My father maintained the jovial detachment that had always been his defense against emotional complexity. Neither asked about my new home. Neither mentioned my sister, who had apparently moved to Colorado after a job opportunity materialized following the foreclosure. Neither acknowledged what had happened or offered the apology that might have begun genuine healing. As we finished dessert, a tiramisu my mother praised extravagantly while barely tasting, my father cleared his throat with a familiar preamble to financial discussions. "We've been revising the family trust," he announced, his tone suggesting this information should interest me. "Simplifying some of the provisions, clarifying beneficial ownership. We'd like to include you in the revisions." The presumption was breathtaking, that after everything, I would still willingly entangle my assets with their administrative control, that I would sign updated documents without questioning the terms or implications. that I would trust their stewardship after they had demonstrated such profound disregard for my autonomy. I smiled and declined with the same gentle firmness I had once used with overeager real estate agents trying to sell me properties beyond salvaging. I appreciate the thought, I said, but I'm comfortable with my current arrangements. My father's confusion was evident. He had expected either eager re-engagement or bitter refusal, not this calm detachment from what he still considered family business. My mother's disappointment was equally visible, though whether she was disappointed by my response or by the realization that her emotional leverage had been permanently diminished, I couldn't determine. We parted with tentative plans for another dinner the following month. Plans I suspected would be postponed and eventually abandoned as they recognized that our relationship could no longer operate on their established terms. As I drove home along the river road, watching moonlight shimmer across the water's surface, I felt neither triumph nor regret. I felt the quiet satisfaction of boundaries maintained, of lessons integrated, of growth that doesn't require external validation. The house my family had taken from me had been foreclosed upon and resold, eventually purchased by a young couple who were slowly conducting their own renovation, unaware of the property's complicated history. My sister had moved to another state, continuing her pattern of advancement through strategic relocation. My parents were adjusting to retirement with smaller assets than they had anticipated, learning to navigate financial limitations they had not foreseen. And I was building again, not just cabinets and countertops, but a life constructed according to my own specifications, reinforced against the particular instabilities I had learned to recognize. The river outside my workshop window reflects different light with each season: golden in autumn, steel gray in winter, emerald in spring, silver in summer. I watch these transformations while working on projects both practical and purely creative: a dining table commissioned by a colleague, a set of nesting boxes for the bird sanctuary downstream, an intricate model of the cottage that will eventually sit beside the photograph of my dust-covered hands. Sometimes I think about the house that was taken from me, wondering if the new owners ever sense the care embedded in its foundation, if they appreciate the thoughtful details I incorporated during those years of renovation. But mostly, I think about the unexpected gift that emerged from that taking: the freedom to build a life without the weight of unbalanced expectations, without the constant tax of being valued primarily for what I could provide rather than who I am. I think about how loss sometimes clears space for more authentic creation, how the absence of certain connections allows others to flourish, how stepping away from false obligations creates room for genuine purpose. There's a particular quality to morning light on the river, a clarity that reveals every ripple, every submerged stone, every fallen leaf drifting with the current. I often sit with my coffee at the window seat during these early hours, watching the water's steady movement beneath this revealing illumination. The river doesn't resist obstacles. It simply flows around them, finding new channels when old passages become blocked, adapting its course without abandoning its essential nature. Water remembers nothing, regrets nothing, demands nothing. It simply continues its journey toward larger bodies, carrying what it can, releasing what it cannot, transforming and being transformed by each environment it traverses. On my most peaceful mornings, I recognize this same capacity within myself: the ability to flow around betrayal without being defined by it, to continue moving toward expansion without being diverted by temporary constriction, to reflect beauty even while navigating shadow. This is not forgiveness in the conventional sense, not the absolution that reinstates previous arrangements or pretends injury never occurred. This is the deeper release that comes from recognizing that while my family took my house, they could not take my capacity to build, to adapt, to create sanctuary wherever I choose to establish foundation. That knowledge sustains me through all seasons, as constant as the river's flow, as enduring as morning light, as transformative as the quiet decision to build now for myself and no one else.